speaking on this motion from the side of the proposition, without further ado, I announce Benny Fowler.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all this evening. And I'm speaking in support of this evening's proposition that big business is the enemy of morality. So morality is fundamentally about the distinction between right and wrong. And I believe that it is morally wrong that a number of women workers that I personally interviewed very recently in factories here in the UK producing food products for sale in supermarkets that I presume many of you shop at are earning such low wages that they're having to work a second job to earn enough to care for themselves and their families, are having to choose to go into work when they are sick because they're afraid that if they don't go into work that day, they will lose their job. I believe it's morally wrong that Dolores, a worker in a US chicken factory and a kind of serving a $50 billion industry, which is seeing its profits booming at the moment, has to wear nappies to work because her employer denies the workers toilet breaks. I believe it's morally wrong that Budi, who's an Indonesian worker in the seafood processing industry, has to peel more than 950 shrimps every hour just to earn a minimum wage. And she's standing for 9 hours a day. And in an Oxfam survey recently of Thai seafood workers, we found that 90% of them had not had enough food to eat the previous month. And all these examples, I will argue, are manifestations of an economic system that is driven by and benefits those at the top of a dominant model of big business. It's a model that pursues profit maximization for shareholders. It causes hidden suffering in supply chains. And it creates social instability and exacerbates inequality. Over the last 20 years, we've seen in global food supply chains, based on research we've undertaken, that farmers' and workers' share of the end consumer price of the products they're producing has fallen by 26%. And the share that supermarkets get has increased by 11%. And this is a system characterized also by a lack of adequate regulation to ensure and incentivize businesses to protect and respect human rights and to pay their fair share of taxes that governments need to deliver public services and provide social protection for their citizens. So it's this dominant model of big business that I am describing that I see it to be the enemy of morality. It's a system fixated on just one stakeholder that contributes to a business's success. It creates downward pressure on workers' wages and the prices paid to producers in supply chains, and upward pressure on the profits of shareholders. It rewards wealth and not work. And it underpins an economic system that the latest Edelman Trust Barometer showed that only 1 in 5 people believe is serving them or benefiting them, and that more than 2/3 of people want to see change. And at the same time, governments and citizens are showing rising expectations of business and expecting to see businesses step up on leading on finding the solutions to some of the global challenges we face, such as climate change and inequality. The international community has identified a $2.5 trillion funding gap in the money that's needed to fund the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're hoping that private investment will come in and fill that gap. And we've certainly seen a substantial increase in big businesses' efforts to demonstrate that they're making a contribution to delivering the Sustainable Development Goals and behaving responsibly and sustainably. Some of these efforts are little more than greenwash or PR initiatives, but a lot of them, I would say, are genuinely driven and well-intentioned. And it's not that we don't know what policies are proven to reduce inequality and bring dignity to ordinary people and workers. Fair living wages that enable people to live with dignity, protection of workers' rights, an increase in social protection for people. The problem is that under the current system, it's very difficult for executives and big businesses to make a case for investing in anything that risks undermining short-term financial returns, such as paying higher prices to producers or higher wages to workers, or paying more tax that enables governments to produce public services. So instead, big business usually focuses on increasing profits and shareholder returns. And it's this priority that, when push comes to shove, trumps even the best, kind of most well-intentioned sustainability ambitions. Big business executives are perhaps understandably nervous about prioritizing other stakeholders that contribute to their businesses over short-term financial returns. If the share price of a publicly listed company falls far enough, there's a strong risk that a predatory investor will come in, buy a controlling stake in that company, and replace the management team with a new team that's focused on delivering short-term returns. Unilever, a recognized leader in business sustainability with a long-term vision focused on delivering sustainable goals, was the subject of a hostile bid from Kraft Heinz in 2016. That bid ultimately failed, but since then, Unilever has felt it needs to demonstrate how it is cutting costs and meeting its shareholders' expectations. At the same time, I must say, and I'm sure the opposition will point to many examples of positive corporate behaviour, and there are some. And business has got huge potential to contribute to some of these global challenges we're facing, such as poverty reduction. But that depends on them having the right incentives and the enabling environment which enables them to do that. So some examples would include Burberry, the luxury fashion retailer, which was amongst the first retailers to be accredited to the Living Wage Foundation, which requires it to pay a living wage to its own employees here in the UK, including its contract workers. Burberry's also developed a worker well-being survey, which is rolled out across all its key suppliers, covering more than 60% of its global production, and which ensures that its improvement plans take into account the issues raised by its workers. I personally have worked very closely with Unilever, looking at their workers' rights policies and how they can do better in implementing them on the ground. And Unilever's developed a gender equality strategy, which it's rolling out across its own workforce, its supply chain, its marketing efforts, and on its voice in public policy debates as well. And Oxfam's working as part of a coalition in Malawi to improve the tea industry there, to close the living wage gap for hundreds of thousands of tea workers on tea plantations. There are some positive regulatory examples as well. The UK Modern Slavery Act requires companies over a certain size to report annually on what it's doing and how it's understanding and responding to modern slavery issues in their businesses and supply chains too. So these are all positive examples, but their effectiveness is undermined by the current economic system. If we can only free big business from the straitjacket of shareholder greed, a fairer and more human economy is possible. What's needed are incentives and measures to encourage more democratic and equitable business models, such as employee-owned, social enterprises, new forms of cooperatives, hybrid models, businesses that share greater power and value with workers, farmers, communities, not just with wealthy investors. The reality is that actually many of these kinds of businesses exist already today. They're thriving and they're exciting. I'm talking of companies like the Spanish multinational Mondragon, which has a turnover of £10.5 billion a year under the ownership and decision-making of its tens of thousands of employees, and within which the highest pay employee can earn no more than 8 times its lowest paid. I'm talking about a company like Divine Chocolate, which is 45% owned by cocoa farmers that supply it and has producers on its board. I'm talking about companies like Amul, an Indian dairy company, which is co-owned by more than 3.5 million small dairy farmers. Oxfam is proud to have played a role in setting up some of these kinds of businesses, and we want to see more of them as an alternative to the current flawed model. So, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I argue that the current dominant model of big business and finance that puts shareholders first is the past. I want to see our political and business leaders supporting and implementing regulations and incentives that will push more equitable and democratic business models out of the periphery and into the mainstream. That's how we'll see a more promising future for business, one that dignifies workers and shares the value more equally across society. If you're in favour of a more sustainable and more equal economy, a human economy, then please join with me in supporting this evening's proposition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that speech, Penny. As reflected in her speech, Penny has led Oxfam's private sector strategy aiming to influence policies and practices to help business play a more active role in promoting human rights and tackling inequality. Before moving on to the opposition, I'd like to remind the floor that during any speaker's speech, except the first and the last minute, they're open to ask points of information. During this, you can stand up at any point and say, point of information or on that point. And it is up to the speaker to accept or reject your point, while we do encourage speakers to really take it, because it is a crucial part of the union to sort of challenge the speakers we have here, not just listen to them. And you should wait for the steward to get to you before stating your point, and starting with your name and college before you state your point. So now we move on to the first speaker of the opposition to open the opposition's case. We have Michael Skepinker. Michael is presently an associate editor of the Financial Times, having worked at the FT for over 30 years. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let's just remind ourselves of our motion tonight. I'm speaking in opposition. The motion is, big business is the enemy of morality. And I'm here to argue that big business is not the enemy of morality. Big business is not the friend of morality either. There are, as Penny said, businesses that do bad things, and there are, as Penny said, businesses that do good things. When people do bad things, it could be that they're paying too much attention, as Penny suggested, to shareholder return and to the return to their investors. Some people do bad things in business just because they are bad people. And some people are tempted to do bad things in business because business is just so difficult. It's not just about providing a return to shareholders, it's about keeping your employees in work and in decent, sustainable work. It's about making sure that you're not overwhelmed by the competition that there is in business. Business is very difficult. It's very difficult for businesses to survive. In 1964, the companies that make up the S&P 500 index, in other words, the biggest 500 quoted companies in the United States, could expect to be on that index for an average of 33 years. By 2016, that had shrunk to 24 years. A lot of companies do not last for very long. In an influential book, it was written in 1979, called The Living Company, by Arie de Geus, who's a former executive of Shell. He pointed out that there were companies that lasted for centuries. Shell, where he worked, began in 1833. My own company, the Financial Times, started in 1888. It's 131 years old this year. The Sumitomo Group of Japan can trace its origins back to a copper casting shop founded in 1590. But these are the lucky ones. As Arie de Geus said, the average multinational company, the average big business, lasts for only 50 years before being taken over or going bankrupt. Compare that to just about any other institution, to religious institutions, to educational institutions. This university, as I'm sure you all know, can trace its origins back to the early 13th century. So, given that business is so hard, given that it is so difficult to survive, yes, some businesses, some business leaders do immoral things. We had the LIBOR scandal at the banks for for which some people went to prison. We've had Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where it turned out that 87 million users of Facebook had their details and their data used without their knowledge. We had the Volkswagen scandal, where, as we now know, one of the world's leading companies cheated on its emission tests on diesel cars. But, and I think this is central to what we're talking about tonight, businesses are not alone in behaving badly. Other institutions in other sectors of society have behaved badly too.
Is it, of course, there are different characters who behave badly, but is it not the size of the businesses that means when they do behave badly, the consequences are so profound?
That is a very good point. Businesses are large institutions, but that brings me on to my next point, which is other large institutions which have behaved badly outside business. Now, this may seem a bit of a low blow, given that Penny is sitting here. But Oxfam, I have to say, was in the news last year because it emerged that some of its staff had used sex workers on Oxfam's premises. And shockingly, they did this in Haiti, where they were meant to be helping, in the midst of a devastating earthquake. It emerged Oxfam had accepted the resignation of the Haiti country director, had dismissed 4 other people, and had then kept quiet about it until it emerged in the press last year. MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, another prominent and respected aid organization, admitted that it had had to fire employees over harassment and sexual abuse. These are big organizations. These are famous worldwide organizations. Now, I don't say this to get at Oxfam or MSF or any other NGO. My own profession has had its scandals. Remember the phone hacking scandal. We can look at politics. Remember the MPs and their expenses scandal, or perhaps the leaking of National Security Council information, which should have been kept secret. The point is this: it's not big companies that are the enemies of morality, and it's not NGOs, and it's not media.
What I would say is that you do not recognise the difference between individuals working against the company message and something that a board of CEOs decide from the top in terms of impact that should be ascribed to the company.
No. Thank you for the question. I don't necessarily accept the difference, because people behave in an organization in ways which the culture leads them to behave. As I say, I don't particularly want to focus on Oxfam, but there was a culture of cover-up. There was a culture of secrecy. It was done at country manager level. This was not something done lower down in the organization. I do take your point that it seems that the Volkswagen affair was directed from the top, but I think people take the message and they take the culture from what they hear from their leaders. The point is this: it's not big business, NGOs, the media, politics that are bad and immoral. What is immoral, let me just finish the sentence and I'll come to you. What is immoral is untrammeled and unaccountable power. Yes?
Please wait for the microphone to get to you.
Sorry to interrupt, but so far I was in agreement with your argument up till the point you said that you do not agree with the fact that people are separate entities to the organization based on what the lady earlier just pointed out, because I think the premise of your argument at the start was that it's bad people versus bad businesses. And then when you sort of put the two together and stop distinguishing between the person and the organization, I think the starting foundation of your argument is then flawed, because earlier you pointed out that we need to be able to distinguish between bad people versus bad organizations. So please clarify on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, and that's a very relevant point. The point I'm making is organizations go bad when the people in them behave badly, and that can happen anywhere. I think the problem with NGOs and with the media, we were marking our own homework. Okay, we were the judges of whether we were doing the right things or not. And phone hacking certainly didn't happen, fortunately, in my organization, but it happened in a lot of others, and it went to the very top. I'd say when it comes to NGOs, it's a question of leadership. People don't just behave badly within the organization for no reason. And this is where I come to my central point. What is immoral is not a particular type of organization or a particular type of activity. It's unaccountable power. What is important is we need, through the media, through regulation, we need to make people account for themselves. Penny mentioned some very disreputable things that are happening in companies, people being paid less than a minimum wage, people being exploited. My own newspaper today has got an article about hotel and office cleaners in London and the areas surrounding London, how badly they're treated. What is important is that we have a proper system of regulation. We don't always have a proper system of regulation. It sometimes falls down very badly. Sometimes it works very well. Let me give you an example. If you go into a supermarket on the high street and buy some food, there is a very, very good chance that that food is not going to poison you. If you go to your GP and get a prescription for some medicine and go to the pharmacy and get it, the chances are that medicine, if you're not allergic to it, is not going to damage you. And if that does happen, if you are poisoned by your food or you are damaged by that medication, there are serious consequences for the company. We need far better regulation like that. We need far better regulation of the things that go wrong in our companies, but in our society more generally, not just in business. This is something else to remember. Business is not our enemies. They provide us with the clothes we're wearing today, with the food we ate before we came here, with the drink we'll have when we leave, with the chairs that we're sitting on, with the bicycles that we ride on. And think of what's sitting in your bag or your pocket that you're all very assiduously not looking at the moment. Our mobile phones are made by businesses. A lot of them are made by Apple. Started out as a small company and then became a large company. And when you've finished your studies here, when you go down from this place, you will find jobs either in companies, big companies, or small companies that would like to become big companies, or, as I'm sure many of you will, you'll work in government, you'll work in the NHS, you'll work in NGOs, you'll work in universities, you'll work in schools, and your wages will be paid in part by the contributions of those people working in businesses. There are certainly different ways of organizing our societies. I completely agree. We need to have more sustainable economies that do not automatically put shareholders over and above everything else. I've spent decades interviewing people who run companies. Some of them have been bad. Some of them I felt I needed to have a shower when I got home after interviewing them. Some of them are good. I too have had a lot to do with Unilever. I knew Paul Polman well. I interviewed him often. He was subjected to, as Penny said, a hostile takeover. He did have to adjust the behavior of his company. These things happen, but he defeated it. He was one businessman, and there are others who really argued for a sustainable planet, for a sustainable way of doing business. Some chief executives who talk like this don't mean it. Some of them do. The important thing is that we keep them honest. We have to make sure that they are accountable wherever they are. We can look at any organization and its behavior, whether it's in business, charity, media, politics, education. Some do good, some don't. I don't see how we can possibly argue that business alone is the enemy of morality. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech, Michael. Before we move on to the next round of speeches from both sides, we'll have a round of floor speeches. For this, we'll be having about 2 speeches in proposition of the motion, 2 speeches in opposition, and then 2 speeches in abstention of the motion. To make a speech, please raise your hand and I will select you, and please come up to the floor to either of the microphones on either side to make your speech, and give your membership card to the president to take the minutes of the speech. So, to remind you, today we have a £50 Smokeworks voucher for the best floor speech, and the second prize, again for the traditionals, is a hip flask from the Engravers Guild. So, starting off with points in proposition of the motion, please raise your hand if you have a point. So down there, if you just come up to the microphone. Just right there. Yeah, just go for it.
I found it interesting that our speaker for the opposition spoke about the value of regulation and said that businesses, if they are left to their own devices and seek to pursue growth, will or might run away with themselves, so to speak, and that it is the duty of us who are not big businesses to control them. That sounds to me like it's in favour of the motion. If we need to exert control over big business, that would suggest that big business is somehow not on our side.
Thank you for that point. Thank you. Are there any other points in proposition of the motion? I'd especially encourage you, if you haven't made a floor speech ever. Back there, George.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to raise what I think is quite an important point on regulation. And I think regulation used in the correct circumstances can be a really valuable tool for curtailing immoral actions in big business. But one of the problems that we've seen over recent decades has been when businesses feel that they can get away from regulation, and they feel they can get away with it. We see Volkswagen, who feel that they can fix emission scandals and avoid that being in the private eye and all the fines associated with it. If somebody had told the people at the top in Volkswagen, listen, you're going to be caught for this, it's going to be plastered across the media, and you're going to be facing billions of pounds worth of fines, they'd almost certainly not take these steps. We see the same thing with Purgy, who knowingly sold opioid medication, knowing that, in fact, it did cause dependence. We know now that actually these companies have seen massive hits and massive dents from it. So in theory, there should be incentives for them not to make these decisions at the time. But when regulation falls apart is when companies feel like they can get away with it. And this is an issue when mistakes like this can't happen more than once. It's not like something happens to one person because of a mistake in business, and then the lesson is learned. These are mistakes that have affected thousands of people, millions of people around the world. I mean, recent statistics from, I think, 2016 say that 72,000 people died from drug overdoses in America, the majority of which from opioids, and the majority of whom started off on prescription opioids, which has been traced back to essentially information sent out on opioids that said, in fact, they weren't addictive. So I think what I'd like to say is that regulation needs to be a lot stricter than it is currently, and businesses feel they can keep getting away from it. And that is where we have problems. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. So are there any points in opposition of the motion? Back there. So if you want to just come to the microphone.
So I'm going to perhaps surprise you, considering I'm speaking in opposition, say that I think the point was made best by the first speaker, who said big business exists to maximize profits and improve returns for shareholders. Now, I think the underlying assumption of this debate so far has been that the benefits of big business have always fallen to the wrong people. But who are the shareholders of these big business? Well, in this country, sadly, the general public owns too few shares. Only about 15% of people in the UK own shares. But that's not necessarily the case. In some countries, twice as many people own shares. I think Canada, Japan, Australia, it's more like 30%, 35% of the general public owns shares. So I think what we need to revisit is who is benefiting from this big business. And perhaps the real issue at stake here is that governments aren't creating a culture of share ownership. If there was a stronger culture of share ownership, more people would benefit from the profits. And I think this is an issue which spans both the left and the right. On the right, you see the Thatcherite privatization at the end of the 20th century, which was a big push to get shares into the hands of the public. And on the left, you have ideas such as sovereign wealth funds. There was a new think tank last week, which was widely acclaimed in one of its policies, is to introduce a sovereign wealth fund in the UK. So I think that's an assumption we need to revisit and remember where the benefits of big business can fall in the right environment.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for that point. Are there any other points in opposition of the motion? So, yeah. You want to give your membership card first?
I don't put it on yet.
Okay.
So I believe in the eternal wisdom of Adam Smith can be useful to this debate when he noted, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, the brewer that we can expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Self-interest, which is the backbone of a free market and the driving force behind big business, in isolation may seem immoral, nothing more than greed and excess. Yet, we can all appreciate the lives we lead today at affordable prices, from our clothes that we wear to the iPhones that we all carry, to satisfy our own self-interest would be not be possible without big business. Thus, taking a broader view of this immorality in isolation, we can see that the vice turns to virtue. The lives we lead today are only possible due to the immorality of the fabled butcher, baker, and brewer.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that speech. So are there any points in abstention of the motion? Richard?
Richard Parkins, Trinity College. I think we have to be careful of the wording of this motion. It says big business is the enemy of morality. That implies active hostility. If big business is simply immoral, then it's not necessarily the enemy of morality. Baron Thurlow said, corporations have neither bodies to be punished nor souls to be condemned. Morality is simply not a concept that can be justifiably be applied to big business. I might point out, it can in the same sense not be applied to trade unions either, because strikes by trade unionists are entirely in the interests of their members and cause great distress to everybody else. So I would say, Mr. President, that this motion is misconceived because it's trying to judge business on a scale in which it should not be judged. If you want big business to behave morally, if you want trade unions to behave morally, if you want everybody in this chamber to behave morally, you have a government and a judicial system which effectively enforces moral behavior, however that happens to be defined. You don't rely on people to do it for themselves, whether they're individuals or business, because they won't. Thank you.
Thank you for that great point, Rich. Are there any other last points in abstention of the motion? So back there. Yeah.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Penny and Michael, for really interesting points. I think before I came into this chamber, my argument was no, big businesses aren't, the enemy of morality. But in listening through to both your speeches, I've been swayed side to side. And why do I say that? I think you're right, Penny, in pointing out that there are many organizations, many big businesses that do go against morality, and you've already mentioned many examples, so needless for me to go through them. But I think, as Richard pointed out, I couldn't have agreed more that we have to be careful of the wording of the motion that says big businesses are the enemy of morality. And as Michael pointed out, it's not just businesses, it's other institutions as well. And I think I'd like to draw the attention of everyone here that the old adage as it goes, old saying as it goes, prevention is better than cure. I think this motion that we are arguing or debating here sort of focuses more attention of ours on the cure side, where we feel that big businesses have done something that leads us to indicate that they are being immoral. But I think we fail to identify here that what is it that's causing that. And Michael sort of pointed it out earlier, that it's for us to understand that it's the individuals behind this. And as Penny also pointed out, that we need to have NGOs, charities, to have the good foundations. So I think as a society, we need to instill these values amongst people right from the start. So not just businesses, not just our day-to-day actions. People need to understand that morality can't be a choice. It has to come out of actions practically. So I think if people knew moral values right from the start, be it a business, be it an educational institution, or any other firm or organization, it would just be common practice. We need regulations, yes, and we need the society to act on it together, but we can't just blame big businesses. I think it comes down to person by person and their actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that fine speech. So now moving on to the main debate again. Is there a reply point?
Oxfam, if I may. There's a point of accuracy and
yes,
information.
you have a right of reply to that. So you have a right of reply to that.
Right to reply
just
to
go
that.
ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President.
No worries.
Just very briefly, I feel I just have to respond to Richard's points made about Oxfam as a point of accuracy and information. It's not to deny at all that individuals working for Oxfam very sadly broke with our organisational values, which we're looking into exactly what happened. There's an independent commission underway, a charity commission investigation happening also. But just on the facts, when the incident was reported, an investigation was underway and the people were dismissed and authorities were informed about it and asked no further questions. So I just wanted to put that onto the record.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So moving back to the main debate, next speaker we have from Team Proposition is Tamasin Cave. Tamasin is a writer and prominent anti-lobbying campaigner. As director of Spinwatch, she leads an organization that investigates the ways in which corporate and government propaganda distorts public debate and undermines democracy. Tamasin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello. I'm very confused now because I find myself disagreeing with some people on my side and agreeing with Michael on the other, and with the abstainers as well. So I've been rewriting my speech as we go. Right, I'm going to start. I, as somebody who for the last decade has looked into corporate malpractice quite a lot, could have listed off a load of reprehensible crimes caused by corporations, but you did that, Michael, so that's fine. I thought it would be boring and depressing and unfair, because clearly business does good things as well, which you also listed. It's alleviated poverty by generating wealth. It creates life-saving medicines and technologies that made our lives all better. I don't want to argue on that case. So I'm not going to. Frankly, I'm not one to judge either. I also agree with our abstainers. I think there is a solid case to be argued that I have no expectation that big business will behave morally, nor should they. It's not in their remit to do it. I'm going to cite I don't know if anybody's read the latest Economist. I don't read a lot, but there's a piece on big oil and climate change in this latest issue. And it points out that Exxon is planning to increase its oil and gas production by 25% by 2025, which anybody who's been following Extinction Rebellion will know that's going in the opposite direction to the one we need to go in. But The Economist says, and I agree with them, they say this shouldn't lead us to conclude that Exxon is evil. I don't think it is. I think it's behaving entirely rationally within the structures that we have at the moment that govern corporations. So I'm not going to argue on that either. But, so, back to the motion. Big business is the enemy of morality, and I will argue the case for that. And I'm going to return to The Economist, actually, and this issue of climate change and fossil fuels, because I think it is the moral question of our time, how we solve this. And for The Economist, a very surprising and, I think, gear shift from The Economist here that it said in this article leads us to where I think this problem lies. So, surprisingly, it calls for, quote, muscular government action. And this comes down to your point about accountability, which is mine too. And yet here is my problem, is we know, and you know, and anybody who works in the area of corporate governance knows that companies like Exxon and the rest of the fossil fuel industry has for many decades now been actively and hostilely lobbying against any regulation to control their power or to curb their profits. And this is where, this is, I think, where the immorality and this, yes, and I would argue an actively hostile big business kind of shows its true colours. And that is in its attempt to control governments, in its manipulation of public debate. And I don't need to educate you on what ExxonMobil and its echo chamber has done to public debate around climate change. And its creation of a world where nobody can hold them to account. And I think that is self-evident. Clearly, we are going in the wrong direction. So this is my area of research, corporate lobbying, and I'm going to very quickly sketch out what I know of corporate lobbying. 3 things. And this doesn't apply to the fossil fuel industry. I look at private healthcare companies looking to privatise the NHS. It could be that. It could be food companies lobbying against public health measures. It could be pharmaceutical companies. Yes, they do good, but also bad. It could be fags. It could be anything, any across sectors. So they all work pretty much the same, learning from the tobacco industry, actually. So the first thing is this capture of government, and I use that word purposely. It is a capture of government. It's not just that they surround Westminster, they are inside it, and they do it through a manner of means. Money comes into it, donations directly funding our politics, expertise, getting the consultants and the corporate people inside government departments. You would be very surprised. And through corporate threats, we are going to lose, we are going to leave, we're not going to invest in your country, we're going to take our jobs unless you do what we want you to do, government. So regulate us and we're off. And I have to say Goldman Sachs, I know it's your former employer, is very good at that one. A second thing, man, if I was listing corporate crimes, the charge sheet against Goldman Sachs, we'd be here all night. Second thing, so capture of government, control of public debate. This, I think, is an evil. I do think is an evil because it limits how we think as a nation, as a people, as a humanity, because the control of information that is exercised by lobbyists actively keeping stuff out of the press, framing debates so that we can only talk about them in a certain way, making sure that our media is seeded with third parties that are financed by corporations, whether that's NGOs, whether that is academics. I hate to say it, there are thousands of them in the press that you don't see the corporation behind them, but they are speaking corporate messages. It's how public relations works. And it restricts this restriction of public debate and of information flow, I think, is immoral. And then thirdly, the silencing of critics. Now, this is the underbelly of the lobbying industry. It's much harder to find out about, but it is a very big part of what corporations do, and they do it through sort of the nicer side of it, which is co-opting NGOs onto their side, but it also is divide and rule tactics. So if you are off Shell or Monsanto or BP or whoever it is, and you're faced with an NGO threat, you take that lot, you can engage with them, they're the reasonable NGOs, and you're going to paint that lot to be extremists, and you're going to push them, and you've divided your opposition. It's classic, they all do it. Legal threats, and then intimidation campaigns. They're common. And I think this all adds up to big business behaving actively, deliberately, consciously behaving wrongly, and it is anti-democratic. The commercial lobbying industry has always been anti-democratic. It rose up at the same time as universal suffrage. People got the vote. Industry decided it needed a way of defending itself from popular will. And I think it is tyrannical. Chomsky uses the word tyrannical. I think it is when you study it. Big business has created a system where power cannot be challenged, not by consumers. Boycotts do not work. I know you've written about this. They barely do. You can't be challenged by employees. You will be required, if you go and work for McKinsey or any of these people, to leave your morals at the door. You will be fired before you change their business model. We talk about the demoralizing effect of working for McDonald's. It's the same as if you go and work for Goldman Sachs. Sorry, if you don't share their moral code. Anyway, and not by governments. They will not be challenged by governments, and I think a massive indication of this was when Mark Zuckerberg refused, symbolic, but he refused to go before Parliament and answer questions, very legitimate questions about the health of our democracy. Governments will need to be strengthened if we are to take, to quote The Economist, muscular action to compel big business to act morally and to keep them honest.
Thank you. Thank you for that great speech. Next speaker we have from the opposition is Shannon Rollins. Shannon is the student speaker for this debate. She's a first year reading history at Downing College. Shannon, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Firstly, I'd like to thank Tamsin for your amazing speech. It was really, really impressive. I kind of agree with the majority of what you said. I mean, when I first saw this motion and realized that I had to argue against it, I thought, this is going to be hard. Because surely, given the blatant corruption, tax dodging, nepotism, exploitation in profit-driven corporations, it's rather obvious that big business is the enemy of morality. But then I realized something quite important. The problem is not big business itself. The problem is that big businesses are sometimes corrupt. But I would argue that big businesses don't have to be corrupt. And therefore, big business does not have to be the enemy of morality. This motion essentially assumes a fundamental and irreconcilable dichotomy between morality and big business. And I would like to propose that the two can, in fact, be reconciled. So I'm going to outline two main lines of argument, both of which are closely connected. So don't worry, this speech is going to be very orderly, organized, and easy to follow. Firstly, I'm going to argue that big business is not the enemy of morality according to our definition of morality in this country. And if for some very strange reason you aren't convinced by that bulletproof argument, I'm going to present a second bulletproof argument that big business can still operate within the free market framework and be profitable and productive, but without being corrupt and therefore immoral. We just need more rules and regulations in place. As Penny pointed out, big business does have the potential to be a force for good. Let us start by examining a definition of morality. The Cambridge Dictionary describes morality as a set of personal or social standards for good behavior and character. Crucially, this implies that this set of standards is not objective. It is always subjective to one's personal principles and convictions or to social norms, values, and expectations. I'm going to focus on Britain because, well, we are in Britain. In our society, this set of standards might include equality, compassion, fairness, and respect. In the Soviet Union, just to give a somewhat rogue example, the very concept of big business would be seen as utterly morally unacceptable because the notion of private individuals making immense wealth purely for their own private interest and not in the interest of the wider social community is fundamentally at odds with the communist ideology. But we are not in the Soviet Union. Liberal free market capitalism underpins the very foundations of our society, whether people like it or not. So does the freedom of the individual, so does private property, so does private enterprise. And the British people value this ideology. Granted, these values do sometimes come into conflict with some of the moral values that I have just listed. For example, the corrupt tax-dodging tendencies of some big corporations might be seen as an injustice and an affront to the most basic principle of proportional equality. The concept of monopolies, as another example, might be seen as a fundamental injustice, or the sweatshop exploitation which huge retailers such as Primark use to keep prices down could be seen as fundamentally in conflict with compassion, equality, and justice. There are endless examples of this. But what I would like to stress is that this does not inherently pit big business against morality, which leads me very smoothly onto my second line of argument. There is no reason why big business cannot be reformed and regulated, as many of our speakers have pointed out, so that it can be reconciled with the British conception of morality. The free market can still operate successfully within a moral framework. It just depends on how we define and lay out that moral framework. And it can alleviate poverty at the same time by keeping living costs and food prices down. Big business is the very foundation of our economy, in particular the city. These businesses generate enormous revenue, and as long as they pay their taxes, fuel the UK economy. Big business has become subject to almost universal scorn. Just 21% of respondents to a poll said they have a great deal or even quite a lot of confidence in big business. It's all too easy to forget that big business spurs innovation, generates revenue, and produces masses of jobs. Vilification of big business obscures this fundamental truth. Small businesses are good in their own way in that they create more opportunities, but it is big business which really keeps people in employment. Small business, which account for 99.7% of all companies, generate less than 2/3 of our new jobs, which means that the 0.03% of companies that are big create 1 out of every 3 new jobs. I would say that's more than pulling their weight. And this is a case for morality in big business, because keeping people in employment in turn keeps them out of poverty. Tax dodging, personal corruption, overseas exploitation, underpaying employees, and the hoarding of money in offshore accounts undermines the potential of big business to be a force for good. It is these associations with big business which give it its bad name. But if we can solve these issues through improved regulation, we can moralize big business. Yeah.
The opposition have introduced this argument, which was mentioned by a floor speaker as well, that no one has any responsibility to act morally. You should just be regulated to do so. What a horrible conception of morality.
I would completely disagree. I mean, we live in a liberal free market economy, and that's kind of what we pride in. It's not necessarily compatible with the concept of morality, and we kind of have to accept that, and we can attempt to reconcile the two, as I'm suggesting. But I think we have to accept that we don't necessarily place morality as one of our kind of principal values in this society that we live in. Right, where was I? So, for example, there is no reason, going back to the point of regulation, why we can't introduce an accountable body to investigate and prevent corruption in big businesses by imposing fines and other penalties for companies who engage in corrupt practices such as tax avoidance and making money. And this is, of course, not only in the... What do you mean by buy votes? I might be ignorant.
In terms of lobbying. In terms of lobbying and controlling the interests of public individuals. So as a result, you're talking about employment being the way out of poverty, but of us, so many people in this country, just here, you're talking about this country being the foundation of morals that we're discussing, who personally are working full-time and beyond, and are in poverty as a result of there being a lack of regulation that this market can't enforce due to lobbying.
Well, perhaps the solution then is to introduce more regulation to control lobbying. I mean, I can't claim to be an expert on this issue of lobbying. I mean, did you? I thought you were going to say something.
I absolutely agree. The government was going to introduce a lobbying register. There's
wow.
Things, a statutory register of this. The one they introduced is a sham. It's shit.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so exploitation, both human and on an environmental scale, is another issue which we need to address. And again, as I've been stressing, the solution is regulation. I'm not going to try and morally legitimize the exploitation of illegal immigrants in this country, nor the inhumanity of labor exploitation overseas. Nor will I attempt to argue that the environmental damage perpetrated by the auto, mining, oil, and chemical corporations is in any way not extremely immoral. But again, the issue is that this disparagement of big business obscures the other side of the coin. For example, companies are accused of following a profit motive even as they promote the technology as a means to address world hunger, for example. Big businesses do have the potential to be a force for good in terms of morality. And we forget that treaties such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol are in place to keep the greenhouse emissions of big businesses to as low a level as possible. This is something we're working on. It's not perfect, but it's something that's possible. the achievement of reconciling big business and morality isn't, we're not quite there yet, but it's something that, that we have the potential to achieve. And let us not also forget that if we want to enjoy the benefits of consumerism, we cannot really occupy the moral high ground. In terms of human exploitation, without a doubt, we need far more regulation if we're going to get close to moralizing big business. And this is where I think organizations such as the UN should be stepping in. Minimum wages overseas would be one potential moral solution, as would tighter employment regulations in Britain to prevent the exploitation of illegal immigrants. And that would be public money well spent, because the economy would reap the benefits in terms of more taxes. So, I have not argued that big business in its current state has an utterly clean, moral, shiny state. Newsflash, it does not. But that doesn't mean there is no hope. Big business does not have to be morality's worst enemy. The two can work together. Probably reluctantly at first, but it's doable. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech, Shannon. Before moving on to the last two speakers in the main debate, we'll move on to another round of floor speeches in the same order. So are there any points in proposition of the motion? Just down here.
I'm not going to go back and forth and return to all the previous arguments we've had, because yes, businesses act bad and yes, they act good and blah, 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 blah. But I'm more going to draw on a point that you mentioned very briefly in the fact that big business seems to be a manipulator of morality in terms of hypocritical window dressing and how we market ethical concerns for their own benefit. So, i.e. using the distinction between right or wrong for our own benefit, to go back to the definition of morality. If we go to Kantian ethics as defining, in terms of acting what is good, and not treating people as a means to an end and considering them as an end in themselves, this obviously goes against a large portion of acts we see by big businesses in terms of combating ethics. And especially due to the nature and the interest of shareholders, as we have been through in free market capitalist economy, this particularly fosters this kind of environment. And if we looked at Alan Sugar, who has commonly said, right, you need to brand your business. Are you going to be the ethical one? Are you going to be the social one? Like, you have to draw on a brand, and that's particularly relevant. And whilst not obviously every single ethical decision and branding opportunities made necessarily have that intention, it is a part of business, and we have to accept that. And especially given nowadays, and we have a bit more of an ethical concern, because let's be real, Blue Planet hit us all a bit hard, and Facebook and their reputation clinging on to what little moral reputation they have for their patronizing adverts and protecting our privacy. But we have to acknowledge that no matter if this is not universal, it does happen. And if someone were to manipulate me, they would certainly be my enemy. So that's why I'm going to argue in proposition.
Thank you. Thank you for that point. If you can just collect your membership card as well. Sorry. Yeah. Any other points in proposition of the motion? Anyone? Did I see a hand there? Oh, just down there. Yeah, no worries.
Give you the number later. In terms of the question, as you were discussing it, there is some conflation between the idea of big business and corporate personhood. And there obviously is possibility for there to be a big business, which is, for instance, state-owned utilities. That could also take the shape of big business. And questions of morality would take a slightly different shape there. But if we're talking about, in a philosophical sense, the question of morality, it's difficult to define different moral systems. And many people who have thought about this, and moral philosophers, have come up with different ways of essentially attempting, how do you decide what the best course of action is? And the best course of action being something larger than a concept of individual gain, although in some moral systems, then the people have made an argument for that. But as in terms of having a really big force in a society that inherently cannot participate in the morality of personhood, that they cannot be an individual attempting to make choices morally, negates, it says that they have to be in opposition to it. And that there is also, I didn't write this down, but, but there is also just the sense that, I'm trying to remember the quote of this, that cooperation is the ability to make individual profit without individual responsibility, or something to that effect. And to what extent you can have morality without a belief in individual responsibility. And that is the underlying concept of cooperation.
Thank you. Thank you for that speech. Are there any other points in opposition to the motion now? So any points in opposition to the motion? Just front row there. Yeah.
So firstly, Shannon touched on the definition of what morality is and said it was subjective, but I think that we can all agree that certain things are objectively immoral. So for example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal was immoral, but so is the molestation of children, so is bribing people to let your children into college. So there are many, many immoral things that we can look at throughout society. So I think that the answer to this debate is, if big business isn't the enemy of morality, what is? So what drives big businesses to do immoral things? What drives religion and religious institutions to do immoral things? What drives education institutions to do immoral things? And it's the need to have more. It's the need to want more. It's the need and the idea to think that you can have more without having any sort of consequences beyond that. So we have to move past this idea that if big business didn't exist, we wouldn't have immorality. We would still have immorality in life in general. So that means it cannot be the enemy of immorality. The enemy of immorality is greed, I think.
Thank you for that point, Owen. So are there any other points in opposition to the motion down there?
To me, one group that has gone remarkably under-discussed in this debate is small businesses. Like, everyone seems to imply, like, Cambridge Analytica was a small business. Like, it employed a few hundred people. Like, small businesses do an incredible amount of harm. And just by listing the fact that, like, ExxonMobil is a huge company that does loads of things around the world, yeah, of course it's done some bad things, but it's a big company. Whereas a small company, you can't see all the bad things they do. So if a restaurant in Cambridge employs 10 people and the owner sexually harasses people the entire time, you're never going to hear about that in the national press. So I would argue that in many ways, big business is morally preferable to small businesses. Because we can actually see what they're doing. We can go to their headquarters, we can look through their records, we can figure out what they're doing, we can actually regulate them. You can't regulate 10,000 small businesses as easily as you can one large company. So instead of thinking about this in terms of kind of smallness being beautiful and some sort of kind of archaic, kind of, that's how it used to be in the past, so why not keep that up? Why not embrace the benefits of scale? Like, I think one of the big mistakes here is this kind of romantic idea that something is because like small businesses are preferable just because they're small. I don't think that's true.
Thank you for that speech, Adam. Lastly, are there any points in abstention of the motion? Down there?
So the reason I'm speaking in abstention is because I haven't really got a clear idea of what exactly is this motion, because big business is quite a kind of broad term. What makes a big business a big business? Like, did Steve Jobs suddenly one day get past like a certain sales figure and suddenly go, yep, today is the day I'm going to start being immoral? But then, equally, what makes you like the enemy of morality? I mean, like, yes, we've heard lots of examples of big businesses doing bad things, lots of big businesses doing some good things. But for example, with climate change, we've heard that they need to be regulated more. With lobbying, we've heard that they need to be regulated more. So perhaps could I suggest a change of the motion for the final two speakers to this House believes that big businesses are on average amoral, but we can all agree that politicians taking the lobbying money and not regulating the big businesses are the ones who are truly immoral. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that speech, Vincent. Lastly, last floor speech of tonight. Any points in abstention? Down there.
Okay, so I'd like to agree with the previous speaker quite a lot. I think there is a certain element of importance that the state has to play in this debate, and for that I'd like to take a little history lesson. Before the 1960s and 1970s, there was less of this notion that, business had to provide the maximum amount of revenue for its shareholders and its investors. There was more of a sense that business is a public institution which works for the benefit of the people and can be trusted. Maybe that's a bit optimistic, maybe it isn't. But I would say that after the 1960s and 1970s, when more neoliberal thinking came around, that thinking sort of shifted. And one of the reasons why that thinking was able to take shape was because wealthy corporate individuals and interests were able to influence politicians to deregulate things and to institute a new type of the Washington Consensus, IMF loans, the World Bank, all of these international institutions working together, or perhaps not working together, but being influenced and taking on this bribery, this lobbying, and being immoral in themselves, which then gave businesses the vehicle to be immoral. And the reason that they had to be immoral is because we all know that if they're not, then they're going to be taken over by a bid, and then they're going to go out of business. So maybe if you want to survive, then you should be immoral in the first place. But who gave you the reason to be immoral? Was it yourself, or was it the politicians? So then who do we blame? Do we blame the politicians or the businesses? I think we blame both.
Thank you for that point. So now moving back to the main debate, last speaker from the proposition, to close the proposition's case, we have Adam Swirsky. Adam is a Labour councillor and director at Social Finance, a not-for-profit social organisation that helps find better ways to tackle social problems. Adam was a Speaker's Officer of the Union and a graduate of Queen's College. Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. And it was a wonderful debate up to the last couple of speakers when all of a sudden it took a turn for a worse and people suddenly turned on politicians. I don't know why all of a sudden the energies were fired on the last speaker from the proposition, who happens to be the only person who's been elected to public office. But I'll ignore that and we'll focus on the main motion tonight. And I feel like this debate has been excellent, but it's been largely conducted in prose. And what we need to end this debate is a little bit of poetry. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to write a full poem, so instead you have a haiku. Big business, you are so big. Big, 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 big. Too big. I rest my case. Or maybe just one or two words more. And in particular, I was very concerned in the last half hour of this debate that the opposition seemed to concede this idea that if you have markets, you do not have morality. Now, that's something that anyone who follows Michael Sandel would be horrified by. But it's also devastating to think that if that was a choice, if we did have to choose between a moral civic life and markets which give us phones in our pockets, that we would choose the markets. But on our side of the motion, we're going to make the strong case. And we're going to make exactly the argument that those last couple of speakers were asking for, which is why is it that we're so focused on big business? Why not politicians? Why not the NGOs? Why not others? What happened to Steve Jobs? How did he suddenly become so mean when he got to a certain scale? And I'm going to argue exactly that something does happen, something bad happens when business gets big. Some nasty, some brutish thing takes root. When a business moves from being the product of a plucky entrepreneur to the torpid, bloated monstrosities that populate our stock markets today. And here's how it works, and this is exactly the question that was posed by that speaker in abstention. What happens? Well, first they add people, and then they add more people, and then they add more people. And what happens is they get to a special number, which is 150 people. It's called Dunbar's number. Many people will have heard of it. It's the limit to how many people can form stable social relationships. And what happens after this number? Why does suddenly it change? Well, colleagues become anonymous. They melt into the crowd, and business shifts from being band of brothers and sisters to a smorgasbord of strangers. It's no surprise that Cambridge colleges have around 150 students per year group. And that's why your Cambridge college mates are your bestest friends, and the college next door, the enemy. And I know that Cambridge has been in the news the last few days for important reasons. And if you must know, to put it on the record, that I absolutely support a full and public inquiry into the closure of Cindy's for the next 2 years. Justice must be done. Now, another thing that happens as business grows is it shifts from being run by owners, to being run by managers. The famous principal-agent problem. You see, owners care. They've got skin in the game. Managers care about their careers. And in 2010, when Toyota had to recall 8 million cars because of issues with their brakes, the company president, Akio Toyoda, bowed deeply in the Japanese tradition of abject apology. He said, "I'm the grandson of the founder, and all the Toyota vehicles bear my name. For me, when the cars are damaged, it is as though I am as well." Now, Toyota is a big business, you will have noticed, which is why it took them 3 years to make that apology. But at the very least, there was that connection, that blood bond between the founding family and the product, which is not the case in most big business today. But there's more, because if companies eventually get to a scale, when the scale itself becomes the problem, they become too big to fail, and their failures become too big. Now, everyone knows about the banking crisis, and we've discussed already the perils of today's tech giants. And we know that Facebook, just in 2016, was linked to the rise of Trump and Britain's departure from the EU. Of course, only one of those things has actually happened. The other is still work in progress. The problem is not that Facebook is bad. It's that it's big. If you connect 1,000 people and something goes wrong, then your company has a problem. If you connect 1 billion people and something goes wrong, then the people have a problem. And businesses today are now at a scale that we've never seen before. In the 1990s, Microsoft and Intel were considered the dominant forces. Everyone thought that they had it all sewn up. But in the year 2000, Microsoft had 45,000 employees. In 2018, Amazon had 650,000. So,
can you explain why the cricket corruption scandal occurred when cricket teams have only 11 people in them?
Oh, wow. I wish, that's right. I wish the cricket teams only had 11 people. I suspect there are a few more managers and marketers and, perhaps some journalists and bankers and all sorts of people behind them as well. But of course, the argument, and the gentleman at the end, made the point about small businesses, and of course, small businesses do things that are bad. But this is exactly the point that I make today, which is that 6 days ago, the world had $3 trillion companies. And the question is, what dangers do those empires have in store for us? Can we predict the scale of damage that could be caused if one of those companies does something truly wrong? And they are doing things that are wrong and have dangers to this very day. But look, I accept fully the joint stock company, the forebearer to the modern firm, was an amazing human invention. And one of the earliest was an English firm called the Company of Merchant Adventurers to New Lands, founded in 1553. And how exciting the day must have been when it's received its royal seal, the hope of its 240 adventurers, all bought in at the price of £25, set upon the company's maiden voyage. Now, 3 company ships set out in search of new trade routes to China. 2 landed in Lapland, and every crew member died. But the idea of the corporation lived on, and the idea is the powerful thing. And my favorite author, Yuval Noah Harari, talks about this in *Sapiens*. He says, a company is a figment of our collective imagination, a legal fiction. It can't be pointed at, and this point was made earlier. It can't be pointed at. It's not a physical object. And yet, like you or me, it's bounded by the laws of the countries in which it operates. It can open a bank account. It can own property. And indeed, a philosopher of the 1970s said corporations can be fully fledged moral persons. But there's something odd about this. There's something very strange. Because although a company is just an idea, it's a powerful story that coordinates human effort and ingenuity across continents and through decades. But a good story doesn't mean that it acts in a moral way. And that's why some have compared modern corporations to psychopaths. It's not such an eccentric view. A blog on the ACCA website, it's the Global Association for Accountants, was called Are Corporations Psychopaths? It says, in law, corporations are people. And yet they feel no empathy, guilt, or remorse. Many are explicitly established to generate a profit, so they primarily serve their own interests. And that obsessive self-interest gives us a clue as to why big businesses endure despite all their issues. Because once a business reaches a certain size, it becomes hard to keep preserving itself just by serving its customers and citizens, and easier to raise the drawbridge for competitors. And that's exactly why Tamasin outlines so clearly why US companies spend $3.5 billion a year lobbying the Congress, obviously not in the interests of their customers. So look, big business is bad. But the question that many have raised tonight, and indeed the last speaker on the floor asked us to redefine the whole motion, is it the enemy of morality? Is it enough to know that there are not only bad big businesses, but the bigness itself as a concept is so deeply problematic? And here's what I say. What is morality if not responsibility? And what is big business but the absence of both? And that's why the two are enemies. It's not because all businesses are immoral. Of course they aren't. And we've talked about the good things they've done. And even when morality exists, it serves its purpose, because only through darkness do we see light. The issue is not the immorality. It's the amorality, the lack, the hole, the void. The cold heart of big business, the metallic touch of the corporation, the eyes are open, but there's nothing beyond. And I ask you to do what you can to preserve the moral fabric of our civic life. And that is, of course, the voting proposition tonight.
Thank you for that speech, Adam. Now, to close the opposition's case and the debate as a whole, we have Bobby Vedral. Bobby is a macro-political analyst who runs his own fund, MacroEagle. He is also the UK representative of the German Economic Council. Bobby left Goldman Sachs in March 2018, where he was a partner and global head of market strats. Bobby, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much for the invite. And as a foreigner, let me tell you, it is really interesting to see that obviously this is the birthplace of debates. Observing the Bundestag versus the Westminster, you clearly notice that at the Bundestag you get talked at. Well, in Westminster they truly debate. And I sometimes think we don't have gilets jaunes here because they see them fighting on telly. So I have to say it's really it's a privilege to witness the birthplace of the debating. Given the time and given that all that has been said, I will keep myself very short. We have already mentioned a lot about, obviously, the wealth and the prosperity corporates have created. Nobody questions that. I think it is a very important point that it is, in many cases, is the human element. Because when a gentleman just said that corporates, the mission is profitability without responsibility, that's not true. Obviously, managers who are found guilty get prison. It's a different question that in some cases, in countries, it doesn't happen. And that's really the key thing. From my perspective is, if you think about it, Karl Marx, he got the logic completely right. Right? He said the concentration of wealth will continue and continue, and revolution is inevitable. What he and many other economists make the mistake is that they don't and forget politics. Because obviously politics changes that, and nobody would have expected that it was Chancellor Bismarck who bring things then social rights, and that effectively the economy of a nation, the politics of a nation would adapt create workers' rights, etc. He had not even envisaged the possibility that that would happen. And I think this is very important because corporates change over time, and corporates are a function of the culture and geography they are in. Let's just look at Europe. In Europe, we have three forms of capitalism, obviously not looking to the east, where they have something different. Just in the EU, we have here in Britain, you have a liberal market economy. A liberal market economy is one where competition rules to the max. In Germany and in the Nordic countries, we have something that's called soziale Marktwirtschaft. It's a collective market economy. What you have in a collective market economy, there's more collaboration between the companies. That's why we have apprenticeships. That's why, and by the way, in Germany, many bank CEOs have gone to prison. And in the south, we have the Mediterranean type economy, which believes strongly in the state and big companies, etc. There is no bad or wrong. It's a choice. Which one was the last big tech company, which obviously all the technology we currently use for has ever been built in a collective economy? None. There is not a single example of any big technology company that was created in a collective market economy. Collective market economies are very good for incremental growth like engineering. It is the liberal market economies which tend to be historically freer in their overall way of life, that they also give that increased freedom to business where innovation gets created. No, that's why. That's what I'm saying. We're just talking at the EU. We're not talking about state capitalism, which is a complete different thing, but is a reflection of really that it is the nation and the culture which gives the structure. So it is a reflection at the end of the day of the people and what they really want. So. Very short examples, in the same thing, you can also say Spotify comes from Estonia. But all I'm saying is, at the moment, of the top 150, if you take Spotify, it's probably the only one in there. And it is an anomaly, that's all I'm saying. While in engineering, you can see it also Formula One. You know, all the Formula One is in Britain. Where do they produce cars? On the continent, right? Because it's the engineering versus the innovation. So all I'm saying is, there's no good or wrong, it's a choice. It's by the countries. Let's look at it over time. The gentleman just said what happened in the 50s, 60s. Well, if you think about it from a political economy perspective, there are four sources of power. There is the state, because obviously our first need is always security. Without security, you can't live. The second one is ideas, right? That includes morality, but it can also be like which type of economy you run. The third is production. I mean, what we produce. And the fourth is finance, which obviously finances either the state or the production, whatever. And it now depends on how you move these four. In the moving of these four, I think is a bit letting both the voters and the politicians off the hook by saying, well, everybody just gets bribed by the corporates, because we can clearly see, just in Europe, in our little EU, three different forms of clear differentiated market economies. On the point of time, maybe just to mention this, and this is why I think talking about these four sources of power, business is not the enemy of morality in the same way that hydrogen is not the enemy of oxygen. They are together. It's one system. It's a molecule that only exists because of the other. And obviously, the idea part and the state part is there to control business in the same way as business there control them. I don't think saying, well, if business needs regulation, it is immoral, because that's like saying, well, we also need the police, don't we, on the street? Or should we all be locked up purely because we need police? So the thing is, yeah?
There's a difference between saying that, well, we need the police, we need regulation, and no one has any responsibility to act morally and just has to obey whatever regulation happens to exist.
I strongly disagree. There is, let's look at South Africa, President Zuma. Free press, if you go in South Africa, you use the word state capture by the companies, it's all full of state capture. It's free press, clearly. The guy also has 753 corruption charges against him. The judicial system works. But for some reason, nobody executes. It seems to be a choice. It's not me to judge. but it's very clear responsibility is not being demanded, which again goes back to my cultural thing, that I think we are all a little bit, you know, only know the German word now. Obviously, it doesn't count here. So, hypocrite about it. Anyways, quick, I finished on the history point, and you see this there as well. So if you think about it, and the key question is, how do we think socially, how do we think economically, because obviously these are here the discussions, socially, morals, and our values. We came out of the war, we were economically left, Keynes, we were socially pretty conservative. Then in the 60s, but you're right, we were there, the economy was mainly creators, owners. Then, yeah, and it was a fad. And I have to say, look, these fads tend to last 30 to 40 years and are a function of invention and ideas. I can tell you, when I started off in the 90s, everybody thought it was an absolutely brilliant market economy because the Soviet Union had just collapsed. But what I'm saying is, we started off after the war being conservatively social and left or liberal on the economy. Then came the 60s, 70s. We transformed our social thinking to liberal as well. Then obviously we went through a pretty hard process. You can blame the Arabs for that with the oil. You can blame the mismanagement of the economy. So that we flipped back our economic thinking in the 80s to conservative or neoliberal, but we stayed with our notion liberal. And to be honest, what's happening now, and will, by the way, happen for the next 30 years, is we are flipping our social thinking back to the right. You know, because it's not just US first, it's New Zealand first, Austria first, Italy first, everybody's first. By definition, that, don't worry, will cut globalization, the big companies will get hit by that. And on the other hand, we are turning economically left, which means that there will be more fiscal policy, etc. So what I'm saying is, these things are waves, which can be actively, which are an active function of times and are an active function of culture. And so I have to say, in Germany, we say everybody has the politicians he deserves. I think it is a too easy one to think that we all can absolve ourselves because there is supposed to be this, just because it's not a human, this favorable construct of a corporate. Corporate is done by humans, humans are regulated by humans, and those humans are getting voted in by the humans. And I'm the first one to, criticize the chain. Is it moral that Chancellor Schröder, a very famous socialist, who was sitting on the Volkswagen board, and by the way, Volkswagen is a state-owned company, let's not forget, then retires after his chancellorship and becomes the head of Gazprom, the Soviet, the Russian gas pipeline, which again is a state company. To the point of numbers, 150, there's another great number. You only need 3.5% of the population to start a movement and change everything. So we know, I think on that good note, I finish, given the time.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that great speech, Bobby. Thank you for concluding the debate as a whole, which was a really engaging debate as a whole. Thanks to our speakers and also the audience that gave excellent floor speeches. Again, we'd like to thank our speakers for coming such a long way, most of them, and adding to this debate. Thank you so much also floor speeches, especially those of you that were doing it for the first time, and we hope to see you give many more. Thank you to the points of information raised as well today. A big thank you to Louis and Jerome running AV today, Ming doing press, Jake managing the event, and Vincent and James for helping run the event as a whole, and the Easter Committee for organizing it. Apart from that, thank you to the audience for braving the rain today and really coming to what we hope was an enjoyable debate for you. Just before we go, other events coming up next week. So tomorrow we have Chasing University Challenge with Sean Wallace and Bobby Siegel. On Saturday, we have a Zumba class, if anyone's interested. In this evening, we have Feeling Blue, which is a mental health documentary about Cambridge and life at Cambridge as a student, which will be premiering here at the Union. On Tuesday, we are hosting Ellie Goulding, the singer, for a speaker event. And on the Thursday, we have a debate, This House Would Send Its Children to Private School, featuring Natalie Bennett, the Green Party politician. Lastly, here at the Union, we vote with our feet. So when you leave the ayes will be to the yes. So if you are in favor of the motion, go through the door on the right. If you are in opposition of the motion, go through the door on the left. And if you are in abstention, please go through the center. I'll restate the motion, which was, this House believes big business is the enemy of morality. Thank you again for coming tonight, and join me in thanking all our speakers for tonight's debate.